Aren't you even going to say hello to the bride's father? My wife Jennifer whispered in my ear, discreetly pointing to my brother-in-law Robert, who was chatting animatedly with some guests near the altar decorated with white roses. I was standing at the back of St. Francis Episcopal Church, watching my niece Emma walk down the aisle toward the altar, radiant in her vintage lace dress. It was one of those weddings that cost more than a house, but my family could afford it thanks to the thriving businesses we had built over 2 decades. The ceremony was perfect. Classical music echoed through the marble columns, expensive flowers adorned each pew, and 300 impeccably dressed guests witnessed that magical moment. My name is Peter, I am 42 years old, and at that moment I should have been feeling nothing but joy for the wedding of my older brother David's daughter. But there was something disturbing about the way Jennifer insisted that I talk to Robert. Something in the tone of her voice. The way her eyes avoided mine. Over the past 3 months, my wife had developed a sudden and inexplicable interest in my brother-in-law's personal life. She asked about his business, where he had lunch, his work schedule. Always in a casual way, as if it were just light-hearted conversation between siblings-in-law. "I'll say hello to him later," I muttered, keeping my eyes fixed on the ceremony. I don't want to disrupt this special moment for Emma. But Jennifer was no longer by my side. I turned my head and saw her walking toward the side exit of the church, the one that led to the back gardens where photographers usually took post-ceremony photos. Her posture was different. More anxious. More determined. Robert had also disappeared from his conversation group. A cold shiver ran down my spine. After 15 years of marriage, you develop instincts about your wife's behavior. And all my instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. I waited a few minutes, pretending to pay attention to the Reverend's words, but my eyes were discreetly scanning the room. Neither Jennifer nor Robert were anywhere inside the church. I walked quietly toward the side exit, stepping carefully so as not to make noise with my leather shoes on the polished marble floor. The back gardens were a maze of rose bushes and ornamental fountains, with several hidden corners that provided privacy for intimate conversations or romantic photos. It was behind the main fountain, hidden among the red rose bushes, that I found them. Jennifer was pressed against the stone wall of the garden. Her arms were wrapped around Robert's neck. Their mouths were glued together in a passionate, desperate kiss. His hands explored the curves of the navy blue dress I had bought for her to wear at the wedding. My world collapsed in silence. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of trust, of shared plans, of dreams built together. 15 years of believing that we had something special, something real. I stood motionless, watching that scene for perhaps 30 seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then, carefully, I returned to the church. My brother David was standing near the altar, watching his daughter exchange rings with her fiancé. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod. A nod that seemed to say, "Did you see what you needed to see?" At that moment, a terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. What if David had known about all this much longer than I had? What if this wedding was much more than a celebration of his daughter's love? If you're wondering how a man reacts when he discovers he's been betrayed at his own niece's wedding, keep reading this story. Because what happened next turned what should have been a family celebration into something none of us would ever forget. The ceremony continued around me as if nothing had happened. The Reverend spoke of eternal love and commitment, words that now sounded like a cruel joke. I stood in my place, watching my niece Emma exchange rings, but my mind was completely focused on the scene I had witnessed in the gardens. Jennifer and Robert. My wife of 15 years and my brother-in-law of 37. When they both returned to the church, separately of course, it was impossible not to notice the details that had previously gone unnoticed. The slightly smudged lipstick on her lips. His slightly disheveled hair. The way they avoided any eye contact with me or each other. But what disturbed me most was the naturalness with which they played their roles. Jennifer approached me and whispered, "Where were you? I looked for you," as if she hadn't just been in the arms of another man. Robert greeted some close relatives with that political smile he always wore at family events, as if his hands hadn't just explored my wife's body. The ease with which they lied suggested practice. A lot of practice. During the reception at the exclusive Golden Gate Park Pavilion, I discreetly observed every interaction between them. Robert owned a construction company that had grown exponentially over the past 2 years, coincidentally the same period that Jennifer began to take more interest in the family business. Jennifer, for her part, worked as an independent financial advisor and had access to privileged information about real estate investments in the Bay Area. Information that could be extremely valuable to someone in the construction business. The connection was too obvious to be a coincidence. "Peter, are you okay?" David appeared at my side as I watched Jennifer chatting animatedly with Robert near the bar table. "You seem distant." I studied my older brother's face. David had always been the more astute of the two of us. While I devoted myself to software engineering, he built an empire in real estate. His ability to read people and situations was almost supernatural. "Just taking it all in," I replied carefully. "It's a special day for Emma." "Yes," he agreed, but his eyes followed my gaze toward the bar. "Very special. Weddings have a unique way of revealing truths." The deliberate pause in his sentence made me gulp. "What kind of truths?" David smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile I'd seen him use in tough negotiations, when he was about to reveal information that would completely change the game. "You know, Peter, when Emma started planning this wedding a year ago, I hired a security company to handle the event. Discreet security, of course. We didn't want it to look ostentatious." My heart began to race. "These modern security companies are fascinating," David continued, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "They don't just protect the event. They monitor. They document. Especially when there are suspicions that certain guests may be, let's say, planning inappropriate activities." The blood ran cold in my veins. "David, what are you trying to tell me?" "I'm saying that sometimes people think they're being discreet, when in fact they've been watched for much longer than they realize." At that moment, Jennifer laughed loudly at something Robert had said. The sound of her laughter, a laugh I used to love, now made me feel nauseous. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. "Officially?" "Since October of last year." "Unofficially?" "Well, let's just say my suspicions began when Robert suddenly became interested in attending all of our monthly family lunches. Especially after you mentioned that Jennifer had started working with some clients in the real estate industry." October of last year. 14 months of lies. 14 months in which I believed I had a solid marriage while my wife was planning. What exactly? A romantic getaway with my brother-in-law? An insider trading scheme? Or something even worse? Why didn't you tell me? The question came out with more hurt than I intended. David looked me straight in the eye. Because I needed to understand the full extent of what was going on before I acted. And because, he paused, because I needed to be sure you were prepared to find out not only that your wife was cheating on you, but that she and Robert were using information you innocently shared with me to manipulate real estate deals. The pieces began to fit together like a macabre puzzle. Jennifer's casual questions about David's projects. Her sudden interest in the details of my investments. The times she casually mentioned specific properties she was looking at for clients. Are they using insider information? Among other things, David replied grimly. But that conversation is for later. For now, I want you to watch and learn. Because what's going to happen in the next few hours is going to change everything. What do you mean, what's going to happen? David checked his expensive watch and smiled again. The same calculating smile. Peter, do you really believe I would organize my daughter's wedding without having a plan to deal with problematic guests? Before I could answer, the DJ announced that it was time for the father of the bride's toast. David straightened his tie and walked toward the microphone, leaving me alone with the growing realization that I wasn't the only one who had discovered the betrayal that afternoon. I was just the last to enter a game that had been going on for much longer than I had imagined. And as David climbed onto the small stage set up in the center of the hall, Jennifer and Robert finally allowed themselves a brief moment of eye contact and knowing smiles. They didn't know they were about to discover that some fathers of the bride take protecting their family very, very seriously. David stepped onto the small stage with the confidence of a man who had built a real estate empire from scratch. The hall of 300 guests gradually fell silent, champagne glasses suspended in the air, everyone waiting for the traditional words of a proud father. But when David began to speak, I immediately realized that this would not be a conventional toast. "My dear friends and family," his voice echoed through the professional sound system. "Today we celebrate not only the union of Emma and Michael, but also the importance of transparency in all our relationships." The word transparency was spoken with a specific weight that made Jennifer discreetly choke on her champagne. Robert shifted his weight from one leg to the other, suddenly uncomfortable. You know, David continued, when you build a family business, you quickly learn the importance of trusting the right people. And you also learn to recognize when that trust is being misplaced. My heart began to beat faster. He was really doing this. In public. At his own daughter's wedding. For example, David smiled, but his eyes scanned the room like a predator identifying its prey. I recently discovered that some people close to our family were sharing confidential information about our real estate investments. Information that, coincidentally, resulted in very lucrative acquisitions for certain construction companies. The room remained silent, but I could feel the tension spreading like an invisible wave. Jennifer and Robert were now visibly pale, exchanging desperate glances. Of course, David continued, savoring each word, when you discover this kind of unauthorized collaboration, you have two options. You can immediately confront the people involved, or you can be patient. Observe. Document. Allow them to reveal the full extent of their activities. It was at that moment that I understood my brother's diabolical genius. He wasn't just exposing Jennifer and Robert. He was using his own daughter's wedding as the backdrop for a meticulously planned ambush. And it's fascinating, David continued, how people who think they're being discreet actually become incredibly predictable. Like, for example, always meeting at the same restaurants on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Or how they always schedule business meetings right after these casual encounters. Jennifer let out a small groan. Robert was now clearly sweating through his expensive tuxedo. The audience began to murmur, realizing that something much more complex was going on than a simple wedding toast. But what really struck me, David's voice became sharper, was discovering that this betrayal wasn't just personal. It was systematic. Over the past 14 months, information about at least 12 different properties has been shared, resulting in profits of approximately $2.3 million. Now I understood why David had insisted so much that Jennifer and Robert be present at the wedding. Why he had been so specific about the guest list. Why he had hired a security company. He had turned the wedding reception into a public courtroom. And do you know what else I discovered? David paused dramatically, allowing the silence to hang over the room. I discovered that financial betrayal rarely happens in isolation. It is usually accompanied by other forms of disloyalty. That's when an assistant appeared at the side of the stage, carrying a laptop. David waved to her, and a huge screen descended silently behind him. My blood ran cold as I realized what was about to happen. My dear guests, David announced, as part of our celebration of transparency, I would like to share some images that have been collected by our security team over the past few months. The screen lit up. The first photos showed Jennifer and Robert entering the Bristol Hotel in the city center. Then, images of them in an intimate restaurant, their hands intertwined on the table. Next, photographs of them kissing passionately in the parking lot of the same hotel. The room erupted in murmurs and muffled exclamations. Jennifer dropped her champagne glass, which shattered on the marble floor. Robert discreetly tried to make his way to the nearest exit, but found that two men in dark suits had strategically positioned themselves to block all the doors. The security team. Of course. Now, David continued, his voice cutting through the growing noise, some of you may be wondering why I am choosing to share this information at my daughter's wedding. The answer is simple, because Emma deserves to start her marriage in a family where honesty is valued above all else. Emma, in the middle of the dance floor next to her new husband, was looking at her father with a mixture of admiration and terror. Obviously, she had known nothing about this beforehand. Peter, David called my name, and all eyes turned to me. My brother, would you like to join me up here? My legs trembled as I stood up. The walk to the stage seemed endless, each step echoing in the now deathly silent hall. When I reached David's side, he handed me the microphone. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the sea of expectant faces. Jennifer stared at me with pleading eyes, as if there was still a chance I would choose to protect her. Robert had given up trying to escape and was now leaning against a wall, resigned to his fate. 15 years, was all I could say at first. My voice came out hoarse, thick with emotion. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of believing I had a partner, a companion, someone I could trust completely. I cleared my throat, finding strength in the truth that was finally being revealed. What you see in these photos, I continued, is just the tip of the iceberg. Personal betrayal is devastating, but financial betrayal that attacks the very foundation of everything our family has built. I looked directly at Jennifer and Robert. You didn't just break your marriage vows. You violated business contracts. You used privileged information for personal gain. Financial conspiracy. Illegal use of confidential information. Fraud. With each word, I saw Robert shrink further against the wall. But you know what impresses me the most? My voice grew stronger, more decisive. It's that you truly believed you could deceive my family indefinitely. You completely underestimated our ability to protect what we have built. David took the microphone again. Ladies and gentlemen, the district attorneys have already received all the necessary evidence. Federal agents will be arriving in a few minutes to make the formal arrests. As if summoned, the sound of sirens began to echo outside the pavilion. Jennifer finally found her voice. Peter, please. This is a misunderstanding. We can explain everything. But it was too late. It was past the point where explanations mattered. It was past the point where forgiveness was possible. As the agents entered the hall, I realized that my brother had not only exposed Jennifer and Robert's betrayal. He had given me something much more valuable. He had given me back my power. And now, for the first time in months, I knew exactly what to do with it. As the federal agents escorted Jennifer and Robert out of the pavilion, with 300 guests watching in absolute silence, David discreetly pulled me into a private room adjacent to the main hall. Sit down, Peter, he said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle that had apparently been strategically positioned there. You need to understand the full extent of what just happened. My mind was still processing the events of the last 30 minutes. The public exposure, the photos, the arrival of the federal agents. Everything had happened with military precision that suggested months of careful planning. How long have you been planning this? I asked, accepting the glass with hands still trembling slightly. 15 months, David replied, opening a folder that was stored in a built-in wall safe. Since the first time I noticed Robert asking very specific questions about our real estate development schedules. He spread documents across the table between us. Photographs, bank statements, phone records, even transcripts of recorded conversations. Peter, what Jennifer and Robert were doing wasn't just marital infidelity. It was systematic corporate espionage. Over the past 2 years, they've siphoned off information that has resulted in losses of approximately $8 million for our family. I studied the documents with growing horror. Detailed reports on properties our company had considered purchasing but which had mysteriously been acquired by Robert's company days before we made our offer. Construction contracts that had been leaked to competitors, always resulting in lost bids. This transaction here, David pointed to a bank statement, shows Robert receiving $250,000 3 days after we lost the Palo Alto shopping center contract. Money that came directly from a subsidiary of the company that won our bid. How did you find out all this? David smiled coldly. Do you remember when Jennifer started working as an independent financial advisor 2 years ago? She suggested that you casually mentioned some of our projects during our family lunches. She said she wanted to better understand the family business. The memory hit me like a punch in the stomach. I had been the unwitting informant. Every casual conversation, every detail I shared thinking I was strengthening our family bonds, had been carefully extracted and monetized. She used me, I muttered, feeling nauseous. They used you, David corrected. But here's the interesting part. Once I became suspicious, I started feeding you false information. Non-existent projects, fabricated timelines, completely fictitious investment opportunities. He turned several pages, showing a series of failed transactions. Robert lost approximately $500,000 of his own money trying to capitalize on information that was deliberately incorrect. Each of his false moves confirmed our suspicion and provided additional evidence for the prosecutors. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out loaded with hurt and confusion. David stopped organizing the papers and looked directly at me. Because I needed your reactions to be genuine. If you knew you were being used, your behavior would change. Jennifer and Robert would notice. Besides, he hesitated, I needed to protect you legally. If the FBI found out you had knowledge of the scheme and didn't report it, you would become an accomplice. The reality of the situation began to solidify in my mind. My brother had spent over a year meticulously building a federal case against my wife and brother-in-law, using me as unwitting bait. What about Emma's wedding? You really used your own daughter's wedding for this. Emma knew, David admitted. Not the specific details, but she knew that today would be the day the family finally dealt with the Jennifer Robert problem. In fact, it was her idea to do it during the wedding. This completely surprised me. Her idea? Emma always knew something was wrong with Jennifer. Female intuition, perhaps. She came to me 6 months ago and said, "Dad, if you're going to expose Aunt Jennifer, do it when she can't escape or deny it. Do it in front of the whole family, so everyone knows the truth at once." David opened another folder, revealing what appeared to be an extremely detailed contingency plan. The wedding provided the perfect cover. 300 witnesses, including several prominent members of the business community. Local media present to cover the social event of the year. Professional security system already in place, providing a pretext for surveillance and documentation. "You turned your daughter's wedding reception into a federal operation," I said, still trying to process the audacity of the plan. "Peter, let me explain something about family," David leaned forward, his voice growing more serious. "Jennifer wasn't just stealing company information. She was actively undermining our family unit. Every seemingly innocent question, every suggestion about business, every moment of false intimacy was being used to exploit us." He pulled out an audio transcript. "This is a conversation between Jennifer and Robert from 3 weeks ago. Listen to this." He activated a small recorder. Jennifer's voice echoed around the room. "Peter is getting more relaxed about sharing project details. Yesterday he mentioned the expansion plans for Sacramento. If we can get access to the exact timelines." Robert's voice replied, "Perfect. My contact in the city is already prepared to expedite our zoning applications. This time will profit at least $1.5 million. Jennifer again, sometimes I feel sorry for him. Peter really believes he has a happy marriage. It's almost pathetic." They laughed. They laughed at my naivety. I turned off the recorder, feeling a cold fury spreading through my chest. "Now you understand," David said softly, "why we needed such an elaborate plan. They weren't just robbing us financially. They were humiliating us. Using our trust, our family loyalty, our love as weapons against us." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the wedding guests being discreetly questioned by federal agents in the garden. Some looked shocked, others fascinated by the drama they had witnessed. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," David gathered the documents, "Jennifer and Robert face federal charges for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and racketeering. The evidence is irrefutable. They're going to prison. And me. You," David stood up and put his hand on my shoulder, "are going to rebuild your life. You're going to divorce the woman who betrayed you and stole your family. You're going to sue for all the damages. And you're going to join me in making sure our company is stronger and more secure than ever." For the first time in months, I felt a mental clarity that I had lost without realizing it. The constant doubts, the feeling that something was wrong, the inexplicable paranoia, it all made sense now. "They really thought they could fool our family indefinitely," I muttered. "Arrogance," David replied. "The same arrogance that led them to underestimate our ability to protect what we've built. They saw our family values as weakness, our trust as stupidity." A thought occurred to me. What if I had found out sooner? What if I had confronted Jennifer directly? David shook his head. "Then we would have had a messy divorce, she would have kept half your assets, Robert would have continued operating, and they would probably have moved to another state and repeated the scheme with another family. This way," he smiled, "they have nowhere to run." If you're following this story of family betrayal and calculated revenge, don't miss the next chapter. Because what happened in the next 48 hours not only changed my life, but completely redefined what our family understood about loyalty and justice. We left the room and returned to the main hall. The wedding had turned into something completely different from what we had planned, but somehow, as I watched Emma dancing with her new husband, I realized that maybe this was exactly what our family needed. A clean slate. A fresh start based on absolute truth. And as the last guests whispered among themselves about the extraordinary events they had witnessed, I finally began to understand that my journey was not ending. It was just beginning. When we returned to the main hall, the atmosphere had completely changed. The 300 guests were divided into small groups, whispering intensely about the events they had witnessed. Some were discreetly taking photos with their cell phones, others were making urgent phone calls, probably recounting the drama to friends who had not been present. At the center of it all, Jennifer and Robert were being questioned separately by federal agents in opposite corners of the hall. "Now comes the interesting part," David whispered in my ear as we watched the scene unfold. "Watch Jennifer try to blame Robert for everything, and Robert try to present himself as the victim of her manipulation." As if she had heard our conversation, Jennifer's voice suddenly rose. "I didn't know the information was confidential. Robert told me it was public. He assured me he wasn't doing anything illegal." Across the room, Robert was gesturing frantically to his agent. Jennifer had access to the information through her husband. "She came to me with the proposal. I just thought it was a legitimate business opportunity." David chuckled softly. "Exactly as planned. 15 years of criminal partnership, and now each is trying to save their own skin by throwing all the blame on the other." It was at that moment that I realized my brother had orchestrated something much more sophisticated than a simple public exposure. He had created a situation where Jennifer and Robert would not only be arrested, but where they would be forced to turn against each other, destroying any possibility of alliance or coordinated defense. Peter, one of the federal agents, approached us. "Agent Parker, FBI. We need your formal statement about the information your wife had access to during your marriage." I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Sure," I replied. "But first, there's something you need to know about the extent of what they were doing." Agent Parker raised his eyebrows, interested. "Over the past 2 years, Jennifer asked me several specific questions about our family investments. She said she wanted to better understand the business so she could support me. I naively shared detailed information about at least 20 different projects. I began to list each project, each conversation, each detail I had innocently revealed. With each item I listed, I saw Jennifer turn paler on the other side of the room. She also encouraged me to intensify my monthly lunches with David, saying it was important to keep family ties strong. Now I realize she was basically using me as an unwitting spy." "What about Mr. Robert?" asked the agent. "Robert always showed up at these family lunches. He would ask seemingly casual questions about schedules, locations, budgets. We thought he was just interested in how our business worked." Agent Parker wrote everything down meticulously. "Mr. Peter, do you have any idea how many times this information has resulted in financial losses for your company?" It was David who answered. "Agent Parker, I've prepared a full report. $8 million in direct losses. But the actual figure, including lost opportunities and damage to reputation, probably exceeds 20 million. The agent nodded gravely and turned back to the suspects. At that moment, Jennifer completely broke down. She began to scream hysterically, "Peter! Peter, please! You don't understand. Robert threatened me. He said he would tell about other things if I didn't help him." Everyone in the room turned to look. "Other things?" asked Agent Parker. Jennifer looked around desperately, realizing she had just dug herself into an even deeper hole. I can't. He has photos." Robert exploded. "What photos?" "Jennifer, you're delusional. Stop trying to involve me in your lies." That's when David calmly approached the center of the room and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, you mean the photos from the affair you've been having for 2 years? Or the photos from the motel encounters that document meetings that began even before the financial scheme?" He gave a signal, and the same assistant who had operated the previous presentation appeared with another laptop. "You've seen only a sample of the evidence we've collected," David announced. "But since Jennifer mentioned other activities." The screen descended again, and this time the images showed a detailed timeline. Not just photos of Jennifer and Robert together, but dates, times, locations. Hotel records, credit card statements, even audio recordings of phone conversations. "What you're seeing," David explained like a teacher giving a lesson, "is 24 months of complete documentation. The extramarital affair began in March 2022. The financial scheme began in June of the same year. All carefully planned and executed." Jennifer collapsed into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Robert tried one last desperate gambit. "This is harassment. You had no right to spy on us." David smiled coldly. "Robert, When you started attending our family lunches and asking specific questions about confidential business information, you became a security threat to our company. We had not only the right, but the obligation to investigate. Agent Parker approached Robert with handcuffs. Mr. Robert Mills, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, insider trading, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit a crime. As the handcuffs clicked around Robert's wrists, he stared at me with pure hatred. Peter, your brother turned you into his puppet. He used you just as much as we did. For a moment, I felt a pang of doubt. Had David really used me as bait without my knowledge? But then I remembered the transcripts I had heard in the private room. Jennifer and Robert's laughter about my naivety. The cruel comments about how pathetic I was to believe I had a happy marriage. The difference, Robert, I replied in a surprisingly steady voice, is that David used me to protect our family. You used me to destroy it. Agent Parker now approached Jennifer. Ms. Jennifer Walsh, you are under arrest on the same charges. As the handcuffs touched her wrists, Jennifer made one last desperate attempt. Peter. 15 years. 15 years of marriage. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I walked over to her, looked directly into her eyes one last time, and said, Jennifer, it means that for 15 years you had multiple opportunities to choose our family over betraying it. And every day, you chose betrayal. As the agents escorted Jennifer and Robert out of the pavilion, handcuffs glinting under the chandelier lights, 300 guests watched in absolute silence. Emma approached her father with tears in her eyes. Dad, I'm sorry my marriage turned out this way. David hugged her tightly. Emma, honey, your marriage wasn't ruined by this. It was purified by it. You started your life together free of parasites and lies. That's the greatest gift I could give you both. Michael, the groom, put his hand on his father-in-law's shoulder. Mr. David, thank you for protecting our family. As I watched the family come together in mutual support, I realized that David hadn't just exposed a conspiracy. He had used the most important day of his daughter's life to demonstrate exactly what kind of man he was, what kind of father he was, and what kind of leader our family needed. And when the last guests finally left the pavilion, whispering among themselves about the extraordinary events they had witnessed, I realized that my journey was not ending with Jennifer and Robert's arrest. It was beginning with the realization that I had completely underestimated both the cruelty of my enemies and the protection of my family. And that realization would change everything about how I faced the future. 6 months after Emma's wedding, I was sitting in my new office overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, signing the final documents of my divorce. The lawyer pushed the papers across the desk and said, Congratulations, Peter. You've officially gotten your life back. Jennifer had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Robert received 10 years. The corporate espionage scheme they orchestrated was classified as one of the most sophisticated cases of family fraud ever documented in California. During the trial, we watched Jennifer try to blame Robert for everything, claiming emotional coercion. Robert, in turn, tried to present himself as a victim of her manipulation. The strategy of pitting them against each other, which David had perfectly predicted, destroyed any chance of a coordinated defense. The federal judge showed no sympathy for either of them. Not only did you betray your family's trust, he declared during sentencing, but you systematically conspired to destroy a company that employs 230 families. Your actions represent pure, calculated greed. The media covered the case extensively. The marriage that exposed an empire of lies was the headline in the San Francisco Chronicle. Emma and Michael, ironically, became famous as the couple whose marriage turned into the most successful federal operation of the year. Emma called me the week after the trial. Uncle Peter, I know it was difficult, but Dad did the right thing. Our family is stronger now. She was right. David and I, who were already close, developed an even stronger business partnership. We implemented new security protocols, internal audit systems, and strict policies on information sharing. Our company not only recovered from the losses caused by Jennifer and Robert, but thrived. With no internal information leaks, we won 12 major bids in the following 6 months. Our reputation for integrity spread quickly throughout the business community. What was most striking was discovering how many other companies had been victims of similar schemes. Robert had operated his family infiltration method in at least 3 other companies before targeting us. Our public exposure encouraged other victims to come forward. Personally, The experience completely transformed me. For 15 years, I had blindly trusted Jennifer, sharing not only financial information but also emotional vulnerabilities that she exploited against my family. The therapy I began after the divorce helped me understand how emotional manipulators operate. Jennifer had used classic techniques: gradual isolation from other relationships, creation of emotional dependency, and normalization of questionable behaviors. "What strikes me most," said my therapist, Dr. Martinez, "is that you haven't developed cynicism or generalized mistrust. You've learned to distinguish between healthy vulnerability and dangerous naivety." 6 months after the trial, I started dating Sarah, an architect I met at a networking event. Unlike Jennifer, Sarah showed genuine interest in my life without asking invasive questions about family business. The difference, I explained to David during one of our renewed monthly lunches, is that Sarah asks questions about how I feel about work, not about specific project details. David smiled. "Exactly. Emotional interest versus informational interest. You've learned the difference." Emma and Michael visited me last month. As we grilled burgers in the backyard of my new home in Marin County, Emma asked, "Uncle Peter, do you still get angry when you think about what happened?" I reflected on her question as I flipped the burgers. "You know, Emma, I've discovered something interesting. Anger was essential to give me initial strength, but holding on to it for too long only hurt me. What keeps me motivated now is not anger about the past, but protection of the future." "What do you mean?" "Now I know how to recognize signs of manipulation. I know how to protect important information. I know how to value people who show genuine loyalty versus those who only feign interest." Michael nodded. "It's like emotional immunity." "Exactly. Jennifer and Robert gave me an expensive education in human nature, but now I have tools I never had before." The truth is that Jennifer's betrayal, as painful as it was, revealed the extraordinary strength of my family. David risked the company's reputation and even his daughter's marriage to protect me. Emma supported the plan, knowing it could ruin her special day. They chose total transparency over temporary comfort. They chose long-term justice over momentary peace. Today, our company has implemented a consulting program for other family businesses on how to detect and prevent corporate infiltration. We have turned our traumatic experience into expertise that protects hundreds of other business families. Jennifer wrote to me from prison 3 months ago. A 12-page letter trying to explain her actions and asking for forgiveness. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because I understood that some bridges, once burned, must remain as reminders of paths we must not walk again. Robert tried to appeal the sentence, claiming that his imprisonment was hurting his construction company and the jobs it provided. The judge rejected the appeal, noting that Robert had forfeited the right to be concerned about the welfare of his employees when he decided to operate criminally. If this story of family betrayal and calculated revenge touched your heart, subscribe to our channel. We have hundreds of real stories about how ordinary people found extraordinary strength to overcome manipulation and achieve justice. Some people try to destroy our trust to exploit our vulnerability. But I have discovered that true family is not defined solely by blood or marriage. It is defined by those who are willing to risk everything to protect your integrity. And when you find that kind of family, it is worth any sacrifice to preserve it.